In terms of what happened last year, Solarwinds was hacked, and it was one of the largest hacks ever. And a lot of platforms, retirement platforms that use Solarwinds as their sort of back-end IT infrastructure have been infected with the Solarwinds, with this virus. And it's brought a lot of questions in our space for fiduciaries as to what are the requirements around cybersecurity, what are the responsibilities of committees and sponsors in terms of protecting participant information here. So what is it that as a sponsor and as a committee member, as a fiduciary, I should be aware of with respect to cybersecurity?
Yeah. That would really start with understanding what are the risks associated with cybersecurity and data protection. And to that extent, we really think about them in two buckets. There's, I think, the bucket you mentioned of there's certainly a risk of the hack of a large provider. We think that risk is pretty low. You know, the Fidelities, the Vanguards, the Empowers of the world, those are very large financial institutions. They have very sophisticated cybersecurity. The risk that somebody hacks that organization and has a large theft of data or of assets, it exists. It's probably on the relatively lower side. The other risks to acknowledge are on the participant level. And actually, that's where the risk is really a little bit higher. How are individual participant accounts protected? You know, what are the processes in place that prevent someone from calling up and saying, my name is Will Woodall, I'd like to take a distribution, and make sure that that's not a fraudulent transaction? You know, is the process for someone to log in and request that distribution online a secure process that's going to prevent fraud and prevent assets from leaving the plan without proper authorization?
And maybe just anecdotally, what have we seen in the space in terms of fraud? I mean, we've seen some record keepers have experienced fraud, and we've seen people or some plans be attacked with these types of fraudulent transactions. Maybe give us some perspective there on what sponsors have seen and what they can do to help ensure that their record keepers protecting them as best as possible.
Yeah, I think the fraud probably has been more widespread than most record keepers will acknowledge. Not that it's a significant factor, but I would go out on a limb and say most of the large record keepers have experienced some fraud activity. Some of that is, you know, directly related to the individual. You know, the reality is, you know, people will go to grandma's house and the password is sitting on the computer, and unfortunately, that's going to happen. But it's also been completely unrelated where, you know, just based on publicly available information, a, you know, third-party actor, whether it's through the call center or logging in, has changed an address, requested a distribution, had that processed, requested a loan, had that processed, and can potentially access anywhere from $50,000 to a couple $100,000 in somebody's account.
And in terms of when these types of fraudulent transactions happen or occur, what's the obligation from the organization, from the sponsor, and from the record keeper in terms of hunting this down and correcting it?
Sure. So, you know, it is a crime. So there is a legal process that can be gone through. At this point, we have seen most of the large record keepers introduce a cybersecurity guarantee where in some way, shape, or form, they're saying, look, if a participant is a victim of fraud through no fault of the participants, we're going to make the participant's account whole, no questions asked. And we have seen some of those cybersecurity guarantees kick in where essentially the record keeper is going to make the participant whole and then work on the back end through the legal system to try to recover the money that was stolen. We have seen some of these cases end up in court where essentially there has been a fraud allegation and presumably the participant wasn't made whole and is therefore suing in attempting to get their balance restored. In those cases, they're generally, participants are naming the sponsor and plan fiduciaries as well as the provider. There's a lot of questions right now about what is a fiduciary's responsibility with respect to protecting participant data. Is that a separate and distinct fiduciary responsibility? Some have argued individuals' data and personal information is a plan asset, and fiduciaries have a responsibility to monitor plan assets. That has not been kind of fully tested out in court or in regulation yet, but could raise that standard directly. We've also seen litigation take the perspective of, we know fiduciaries are responsible for selecting and monitoring their service providers. So did the fiduciaries do a sufficient job in that action? One of the probably most high profile cases here has involved Abbott Labs. A participant brought this suit against the Abbott plan fiduciaries and their provider, Alight Solutions. The participant's account was breached through no fault of her own, allegedly. And about $250,000 was withdrawn. Essentially, what the participant is alleging in the case against Abbott specifically is that the Abbott fiduciaries were responsible for selecting and monitoring Alight, and they breached their responsibility in doing so because they should have better investigated or validated the Alight cybersecurity procedures, and that it was not appropriate to have perhaps some of these functions outsourced to Alight, and that there was some kind of breach in that regard. Not seeing that case very successful to date. Certainly a very significant percentage of companies are outsourcing things like distribution approvals to their record keepers. So not a strong ground to stand on that it was inappropriate to have Alight approving distributions. Based on what's been offered in the case on both sides, it seems that Alight did have procedures in place, but for whatever reason, they weren't followed in this instance. It's going to be probably tough to hold the Abbott fiduciaries responsible for the actions by those individuals at Alight. And Alight is not a fiduciary in this instance.
Appreciate the update on the in this area, and we'll be back with more information. If you have any questions or want to talk with us about how we can help you with your program, just give us a call.